So as Pastor Sarah said, today on Evolution Sunday, I'm going to talk briefly about my job. I am a professional geologist, and I work in environmental cleanup, and I'm going to give you the quickest introduction to the industry. So if you are an environmental consultant like Chris here, try not to judge me for what I'm glossing over. But in general, as a professional geologist, or as a scientist, and as a Christian, I believe it's very important to note and to always remember that despite what many churches and what many people say nowadays and the pushback against science, I believe science is one of the best ways that you can serve your community and you can serve the world. There are so many scientific industries out there. I'm talking to medicine, I'm talking to, even, it doesn't even matter. All the scientific industries are focused on this idea of learning something new and expanding our knowledge and creating a better world, or working to fix the damage that we have done to the current world. So as I talk a little bit about the industry and what we do and our goals, I want you to remember that this is about the world, about the community, about what we can do as a Christian to further science. And at the end, once I get past the introduction to the industry, we will talk a little bit about current issues, as Pastor Sarah said, and what we can do to help address those current issues. So this is what I do not do. In environmental cleanup, you tell people you work in environmental cleanup, and they first either think of you washing ducks after oil spills. They get great publicity. I do not do that. I'm also not out there in a hazmat suit. I do not do any kind of urgent, active environmental cleanup at a major spill. I work on major spills, but nothing that is an emergency cleanup. What my specialty is and what I focus on is long-term environmental cleanup. The idea that in the long run, over years and decades, there are risks to living in an urban environment. The environmental remediation company that I work for, this is our logo, we do consulting, engineering, and remediation services, but what I specifically do as a geologist is I model in the subsurface how contamination travels, where it goes, how did it get there in the first place, and then I send those models to our engineers, and our engineers figure out, well, heck, how are we going to get that back out? That is a little complicated to talk about today, so we're going to give a more basic overview of the environmental industry instead. And like I said, I do not work at hazmat environments. I don't work out in the jungle, out in the oceans, anywhere urban. So what do I do? Where do I work? I work at strip malls. I work in parking lots. I've got a project site that's a Target, a project site that's a Costco, a project site that's a dry cleaners. I have a project site that's a Kaiser Permanente medical offices. And most of my project sites start as construction sites. Basically, the idea is that in our modern society here in California, we require the most environmental cleanup when a site is redeveloped. Here in Southern California, land is at a premium. Old industry is being taken down every day, basically, and is being redeveloped into strip malls, into medical offices, into schools, into housing. I have a project site that's a mobile home park. And these places aren't places that you necessarily would think of when you're thinking of environmental contamination and cleanup, which leads me to this slide that we're on right now, which is that consent is a big part of the environmental industry. The idea of consent, that you have consented to being exposed to chemicals. If you're working at a place that uses chemicals, if you are visiting a gas station, you expect there to be gas fumes. If you're visiting a nail salon, you expect there to be acetone. nail polish remover. If you are working in an industry with chemicals, you expect those chemicals to be there. But when you go to your appointment at a Kaiser, or when you go doing your weekly grocery shopping at a Costco, you don't expect that you are being exposed to something. And the state of California says that because you have not consented to be exposed to those chemicals, there are much stricter standards that we will hold those properties to, we will hold those businesses to make sure that people are not being, essentially poisoned by their surroundings. And I would like to stop, and if we can get to the next slide really quick, I would like to stop and say that there is a misconception a little bit when it comes to urban environmental cleanup, that all of these companies are out there maliciously spilling chemicals or hiding what they've been doing or dumping waste into rivers. But here in the urban Southern California setting, we don't see a lot of that. I'm going to say 99 times out of 100, or maybe even 999 times out of 1,000, the vast majority of these companies did not maliciously spill anything. They were following the proper standards for contamination or chemical disposal back in the 60s and the 70s, and now we just know better. Lots of these companies had what are called sanitary sewer permits, where they were allowed to just put chemicals down certain sewer drains, and it was permitted, and that's how things got disposed of. But just like you can get those pinhole leaks in your own sewer at your own home, those sewer lines also developed pinhole leaks, especially because people were tossing chemicals down them. And things could spread or spill even without anybody realizing or even trying to spill a chemical. A lot of these sites are really, like I said, nobody was doing this maliciously, and everybody is trying to fix the problem now, more or less. And I also want to talk really quickly about the magnitude in which we're talking about. We're talking chemicals at the parts per billion. So when I'm saying that these places are contaminated or that they're undergoing active cleanup, we're not talking about gross contamination where you have to wear a hazmat suit. We are looking at lifelong risk. If you work at this company your entire career for 25 years, are you going to have a lifetime risk by being exposed every day for 25 years? Residential standards are also like 25, 30 years, but they include even stricter standards. They expect that you've lived inside 24 hours a day for 30 years in this house. And they include a lot of extra math for protection of children. But we are looking at very, very small numbers here. Like I said, parts per billion when it comes to talking about chemicals in the industry. So there are two ways to discuss how we sort or think about the environmental cleanup efforts. The first way is to talk about our three types of sampling media. We sample soil for contamination, we sample water for contamination, we sample air for contamination. The second way of looking at things is by looking at exposure points. When you're talking about soil, you can touch soil. That's a dermal contact. You can accidentally eat soil on a vegetable, or because you're a child playing in a sandbox. That is ingestion. With soil, you can also get inhalation of particulate matter. With air, our main exposure point is inhalation. With water, you could drink it. Again, you can touch it. You could inhale it. There are many different exposure points. We are going to mostly look at groundwater models here at the beginning. This is how the industry really developed, with the idea that we discovered or realized that we were, as a nation or as a state, contaminating our potential water supply here in the state of California. All water in the ground, all groundwater, whether it's drinkable or not, is considered a potential future source of drinking water, that someday in the future we might need to rely on that water, and therefore it should be cleaned up to drinking water standards. So we're going to talk about a simple groundwater geologic model. And if anybody took Intro to Geology and learned that there were sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic rocks, you can forget about your igneous and metamorphic rocks. Here in the LA Basin, all we have are layers and layers and layers and hundreds of feet of sediments. So our models all look something like this. You have a vadose zone that's unsaturated. That is a combination of soil and air. And then at some point, when you travel down into the subsurface, you hit an aquifer. That is where soil and water coexist. And water flows and travels in an aquifer underground, like giant oceans or rivers. And as it flows underground, it can therefore carry or move chemicals underground. Between each aquifer, as you travel underground, you might find a finer-grained unit made up of not sands and coarse-grained materials where the water flows easily through pore space. These fine-grained units are made up of silts and clays. The water does not travel preferentially through those layers. Those layers are called aquitards because they retard or slow the movement of groundwater. And then when you move through that aquitrade, you'll find another aquifer or sand layer, and these alternating sand layers, aquifers, and silt or clay layers, aquitards, basically alternate all the way down hundreds, if not thousands of feet in the LA basin. So there are two types of main travel pathways that chemicals can take in the subsurface. The first is if you're talking about a light chemical. In this case, light meaning less dense than water. Chemicals that are light or less dense than water typically travel through that vadose zone that's unsaturated down in a downward direction because of gravity. And then when they hit that water, the chemical will float on top of the water because it's lighter than water. And you will get some kind of plume traveling away from your floating chemical source. Light chemicals are in some ways the easiest chemicals to theoretically remediate. If we go to the next slide, if you have a dense chemical, what you will find is the chemical will sink to the bottom of the aquifer, and it will form that groundwater plume in your water, but it will also continue to travel down, percolate through that aquitard, and it will make it to the next aquifer, where it will sink to the bottom again, and then start a second groundwater plume, and then it will begin to sink again through that second aquitard down into a third aquifer. And the dense chemicals can theoretically continue traveling downwards forever. We have a project site in Huntington Beach where we are currently looking at chemicals that have made it, I'm going to say 8 layers down. And that makes things particularly complicated to clean up. In this image or picture that I'm showing, all of our groundwater plumes are theoretically going in the same direction, but in the real world, every layer could have the water traveling in a different direction. So it could be going north for a while, then it can make a turn to the east, then it could go diagonally back and to the left in the third layer down. And at this point in time, you're 3 layers down, you're 3 miles away. People over there in that neighborhood have no idea that there's contaminated water 3 layers beneath them. It makes it much more difficult and to remediate when you're talking about a dense chemical. So let's talk about some simple cleanup strategies. Next slide, yes, that's it. For light chemicals, the main strategy that works well is to pump them straight out. Because they're floating on top of water, you can install a well or a network of wells. Back in the day, in the early environmental industry, pump and treat was the go-to cleanup strategy. You just pump out the product that's floating on top of the water, and you treat whatever remains in the water afterwards, or by removing the source, the rest of the plume just kind of dissipates or cleans itself up by dilution. But treating the remaining is the complicated part. It really depends on what the chemical is and how the chemical breaks down. So if we go to the next slide. My example here for a light chemical is gasoline. Most petroleum products actually are lighter than water. They will float on top of water. Gasoline is pretty easy to break down in the subsurface, theoretically. It's broken down naturally by aerobic bacteria. And most of the byproducts, if not all of the byproducts of gasoline, are relatively harmless. So once it's broken down in the subsurface, you don't have to worry about it. So the main one of the main ways that you could break down gasoline is to just encourage the natural breakdown processes in the subsurface, to encourage the bacterial growth in the subsurface, there are two main things that we do as an industry. One is to just pump in more oxygen into the subsurface. These bacteria are aerobic. They breathe oxygen just like humans do. And one of the problems with gasoline is the fumes from gasoline. I'm sure everybody here has smelled gasoline at some point in time. Those fumes will actually push away all of the oxygen in the subsurface and will make it so that the bacteria that would naturally break down the gasoline can't grow in the subsurface. But if we just stick a well into the ground and use a compressor or a blower to blow oxygen into the subsurface, we can allow the bacteria to breathe and to continue its natural processes on its own. We can also encourage bacterial growth by introducing other sources of food to the subsurface. This is literally done by injecting vegetable oil or molasses into the ground. Give the bacteria something to eat, let it bloom. While it eats the vegetable oil or molasses, it will also eat the gasoline. So in theory, gasoline, pretty easy to treat. When we get to our dense chemicals, of course, things get a lot more complicated. You could install wells and pump out the product if you can find where it has broken through at each depth. Same kind of thing, if you get the bulk of the product out, that will help the remainder break down quicker or have more ability to dissipate or dilute naturally. But it also can get a lot more complicated than that. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about an example called PCE. It's called perchloroethylene or tetrachloroethylene, which means four. Or tetra or perc mean four. But the problem with the PCE family is there's a whole family. There's a whole breakdown chain of daughter products related to PCE, and it's basically a countdown. If perc or tetra means four, for perchloroethylene, the next daughter product is 3, trichloroethylene. The next daughter product after that is 2, dichloroethylene. And the last product is vinyl chloride, which we want to get past, and we want to get straight to the ethenes or ethanes at the end. Because basically, as the PCE family degrades, every step along the cleanup process or the degradation process is more toxic than the last. So you're trying to get rid of PCE, but you've now made the product worse by turning it to TCE. And you've now made the product worse by converting it to vinyl chloride. And this timeline in nature where they don't have the right, maybe, conditions in the subsurface to break down naturally, this timeline for this PCE family can take decades. Decades and decades to make it over the hump to the non-toxic byproducts at the end. So one of our goals in the environmental cleanup industry is to speed up that degradation, to get over the hump, to get past the vinyl chloride as quickly as possible so that we're not taking decades to get to those end results, those non-toxic, that zero goal at the end. To speed that up, we typically use things like catalysts. We'll inject other chemicals into the subsurface that are oxidizers that will react with the chemicals in the subsurface and cause the reactions to happen faster. We can also volatilize these chemicals. They are very volatile. You can get them to go from an aqueous stage to, say, a vapor form by aerating the subsurface and coercing the chemical to become a gas, and then we run that through big carbon filters to trap it. So complications. So that is kind of the end of my groundwater remediation portion of the talk, and now we're going to talk about 3 priorities that are current remediation priorities. The first is a California state priority, and it's called vapor intrusion. It's based on the idea that here in California, we do not get enough rainfall to suppress vapors or fumes that are coming off of these chemicals in the subsurface, so these fumes might be coming up from these plumes into your business or into your home. Here in our picture, we show that there's a factory or an industry that has a plume underneath it, as we saw earlier. But that plume travels, like I said, it could travel literal miles. And you could be blocks away in a strip mall or in a home, and you could be getting fumes or vapor intrusion back up into your facility. Next slide, please. So the challenges for this are that it is still very much so a developing science when it comes to remediation. In 2016, a bunch of cleanup goals were indicated, and vapor intrusion started to become one of the key California priorities. By 2019, they had already changed those cleanup goals by 3 orders of magnitude. We went from parts per million cleanup to parts per billion cleanup. So companies that had closure or were told that they met all of the state requirements in 2016, already by 2019 had to go out and do another investigation and try to clean things up again. The other challenge is determining where exactly the vapors are coming from. I could go out and sample any building in Southern California, and I can tell you right now we would exceed one of our screening levels for something. I've got sites that are close to freeways where you exceed for benzene, or that are shipping receiving sites and you exceed for benzene just because of the amount of vehicle traffic in the area. Many homes and bathrooms will exceed for chloroform because chloroform can form where our chlorinated drinking water meets bleach for cleaning. So I can tell you that we would fail for something in every home, business, or facility. I have never had a facility pass 100% across the board. I would be more skeptical if I saw a building pass than if I got some of these normal hits that we get everywhere. So the problem in vapor intrusion or vapor science is the question of, is that chemical that we are testing for or that we are seeing coming from soil or fumes from the subsurface, or is it coming from something that you're already using in your home? PCE that I was just mentioning as a main chlorinated solvent that we clean up in the environmental industry, PCE is still used as one of the main dry cleaning solvents. If you get your uniforms or your suits regularly dry cleaned, you might have PCE in your home. PCE is also an E6000 glue for those out here there who are crafters. I went and made a rhinestoned object a couple years ago, and halfway through, when I'm reading the back that says use in a well-ventilated area and things like that, I look at the back and its main ingredient is PCE. It is a very successful solvent in industry. Please use it in a well-ventilated area. So what can we do? For vapor intrusion, the number one thing we can do as ourselves, as a community, to increase our own or to improve our own lives is literally to ventilate your house more often. Open the windows every once in a while. If you are like me and you almost never turn on your air conditioning or your heat, I actually have a smart thermostat, and once a day it runs what it's called a whole house air exchange, where we're not running the air for an hour to heat something up or to cool something. It is literally just exchanging the air every day. It runs for 5 minutes, whether I ask it to or not, and it makes sure that the air in my home has been replaced. Open some windows, air exchange. It's literally the best thing you can do to improve your vapor intrusion quality of life. And if you get your stuff dry cleaned very, very frequently, like say you're a police officer, my stepdad gets his uniforms dry cleaned all the time, all day, every day. Occasionally air out your closet as well. And don't be like smelling that good dry cleaned scent. PCE has a naturally sweet scent. You might find that your dry cleaned clothes smell. Please don't huff them. Our next priority. We skipped, yeah. We've got our current emerging priority with the US EPA is the PFAS or PFOA. PFAS, PFOA are the main chemicals. I'm going to call them PFAS for the next couple of minutes just to group the family together. But the PFAS family you may have seen a lot as clickbait titles, these forever chemicals. They are used in a large number of products, most notably in Teflon pans or in Gore-Tex or waterproofed fabrics, but they are used in anything really that is waterproofed or water protective, including, amongst other things, fast food wrappers. When you get a burger and it's wrapped in that wrapper and that wrapper doesn't get saturated or soggy no matter how greasy your burger is, that waterproofing on your fast food wrapper or in your pizza box is made using a PFAS chemical. Basically anything that is waterproof, water resistant, or non-stick has some member of the PFAS or PFOA family in it. So one of the main challenges with the emerging science and the emerging regulations is just the sheer number of PFAS and PFOA families or chemicals in that family. And a lot of companies that started using one of the, I'm going to say worse or more toxic PFAS or PFOA chemicals originally have already switched to using a different chemical in the same family. And part of the problem with the industry is that the toxicologists and the scientists need to individually test every single member of the family, trying to figure out, is it toxic or is it not, and how bad is it on the relative scale of things. At this point in time, of the thousands of PFAS chemicals, the US EPA has only officially tested and released screening levels for 14 of them, which makes it very difficult as an environmental consultant to figure out exactly what we're trying to clean up or what standards we're being held to. And when I said before that we're mostly at this point in time held to part per billion standards, parts per billion is 10 to the negative 9. Many of these PFAS chemicals that have been released, cleanup goals so far, have 10 to the negative 15 cleanup goals. That is another million times cleaner than those parts per billion that we aim for other chemicals. And at this point in time, as a community, it is very difficult, as an environmental community, it's very difficult to meet those goals. The laboratories can't even test to 10 to the negative 15. So it is, I'm going to say, impossible to meet those limits at this point in time. This is definitely an emerging science. Many academics and companies are looking into this at the moment for how can we get to those screening levels, or how can we even measure those screening levels to see if we have a problem in the first place. At this point in time, one of the things that you may not have thought of that has PFAS and PFOA in it is a special type of firefighting foam that is used on fires that cannot be put out with water. These firefighting foams are used most commonly, or have been historically used most commonly, at places like oil and gas refineries, where you might not want to attack a fire with water, but also at airports. So many of the big EPA efforts and a lot of the research that is currently going on for PFAS and PFOA is actually happening at airports. And eventually it will spread to the smaller cleanup sites. At many of our cleanup sites, we have been asked to start testing for PFAS so that the state of California can get a database as to how widespread the problem is in the state of California, but we haven't been asked to actively start remediation, nor is there really a remediation plan that anybody has found that would work yet. So what can we do? The first thing you can do is you can minimize the amount of PFAS products that you personally buy. If you have a Teflon pan, of course, continue using your Teflon pan. I don't recommend throwing something away that's still perfectly good. That causes different environmental problems. But if your Teflon pan is scraped or has lots of scratches across the bottom, I would highly recommend throwing it away. Those scrapes or scratches can allow microparticles or PFAS chemicals to get into your food while you're cooking. Just get rid of it when it's not working, or like I said, minimize your use. But at this point in time, there's not a lot that we can do as a community. This effort really needs to start from more of a manufacturing angle. While the manufacturers are still allowed to produce the PFAS chemicals in mass quantities, any effort that they do to ban the use of those chemicals or to switch from a worse PFAS to a better PFAS chemical is going to do infinitely more to help this problem than any minor change that we can make on our end. And please just stop clicking the clickbait. It's not helping. And a lot of PFAS chemicals, the F in PFAS and PFOA stands for fluorine. So there are a lot of fake, or I'm going to say almost scam type tests out there that will say that they will test your products for PFAS and see if you're using, say, a harmful pan. But you need to remember that fluorine is in a lot of other products out there as well, including our drinking water and our toothpaste and anything meant to protect our teeth. So a lot of these chemicals or a lot of these articles or a lot of these products are just looking for fluorines, fluorinated chemicals, which could indicate they're part of the PFAS family, sure, but they could also indicate that it's toothpaste. So try not to, this is one of those environmental problems where I'm going to say don't overreact. We don't know enough yet to know what the problem is, and at this point in time, just don't overreact. And I'll skip our third one on wildfires because I have definitely gone over time. So sorry about that. If you want to talk to me about wildfires, you can hit me up at coffee afterwards.